George Washington, Aristotle, Napoleon, Muhammad, all fatherless. Most followed person on YouTube, fatherless. Most followed person on Instagram and Facebook, fatherless. Why are all of these significant people fatherless?
Welcome to the Overflow Post, where our goal is to share the overflow of God's work around the world. This episode is brought to you by Covenant Eyes. Sign up today and get 30 days free using promo code OVERFLOW. And now, on to today's episode.
Today we're going to be talking about influencers and their fatherhood relationships. So this actually hits a lot closer to home than a lot of y'all may think. There are influencers, both historical and modern, who grew up in homes with a defective father than you would probably care to know. Let's take, for example, Jeanette Cathy. Raised during the Great Depression by a single mom after her father left her when she was a baby. She's a matriarch of Chick-fil-A, lifelong learner, and JCL namesake. Now, let's just, some other influencers. Influencers are also, more often than not, at least today, associated with being online. Most followed person on YouTube, fatherless. Most followed person on Instagram and Facebook, fatherless. Most followed person on Twitter had an abusive father. So these stats made me begin to question what and why are all of these significant people fatherless. And to begin, here are even more people. LeBron James, Samuel L. Jackson, Adele, 50 Cent, Marilyn Monroe, Eminem, Dave Thomas. He founded Wendy's. That's a really cool picture of Jeff Bezos I just put up there just because he looks cool in it. All have defective fathers. Now, first, I want to define what an influencer is. An influencer is one who exerts influence, a person who inspires or guides the actions of others. And this isn't just online, but it's in other ways too. So you can think about historical figures or online influencers who actually influence outside of the internet and the real world. Let's take, for example, Logan Paul and KSI. These guys are both YouTubers, and combined they have about 50 million subscribers. And I'm going to tell you about their sports drink called Prime. So last year, they founded a sports drink called Prime. And within their first year, they made $250 million. That's compared to, in a 4-week study, they made $51.4 million, or $51.7. Gatorade, in that same 4-week period, made $263.5 million, and Powerade made $53.8 million. And that's literally they're almost about to beat Powerade, and Powerade has been around for forever. And not only that, or not forever, but a really long time. Not only that, they're literally sponsoring the Dodgers, the UFC, and Arsenal Football Club. And this is within their first year of being launched. Now, another example could be Jimmy Donaldson, who I already mentioned is fatherless, and he's the number one person on YouTube, the 5th most followed person on TikTok. Now, Donaldson turned down a $1 billion offer. Remember, he's only 24 years old, for all his channels and associated companies, stating he believed they were worth at least 10 to 20 billion. That's right, billion dollars. Considering all of their financial and influential gains, one must not forget that Donaldson, Paul, KSI, and other influencers are, at their core, human. And every human has a fatherhood story. And it could be healthy, or it could be unhealthy. Dr. Paul C. Vitz, this is my friend, we're going to run into him a lot, but he states a father can in fact lose his authority over or seriously disappoint a child. And he calls this term a defective father, and that is also what we're going to be calling an unhealthy father. And there are 3 types of unhealthy fathers: absent, passive, and abusive. So Stephen Kendrick, co-founder of the Fatherhood Commission, combines those first 2 of absent and passive into his definition of fatherless, stating without a father's presence or involvement. Further, this is just kind of like a little graph because it's really important to separate abusive and fatherless, because while an abusive father is still unhealthy, he is still technically present and involved. However, a father who is fatherless or just not in the home at all because he's absent or passive is still unhealthy, but together they're both defective. So this is a term we're going to be playing around with a bit, so it's good to understand it. Let's look at social media. There are about 3 billion monthly average users, that's every month, on Facebook, and you can see the stats, absolutely crazy. Now, what about the people who are most followed on all these sites? Well, a study of how the top 5 individuals on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, literally the 25 most followed people on one of the most powerful sites in the world, on all of these different 5 sites, 15% had an abusive father, 40% were fatherless, and 45% had a healthy father. And this just kind of brings into question, like, how in the world are they viewing the world, and how are they influencing their view on the rest of the world? Now, I'm going to pick on someone here for a minute. Sawyer. Out of Time's top 10 most historical influences of all time, how many do you think had a defective father? 4. 4 would be incorrect. It's 6. George Washington, Aristotle, Jefferson, Napoleon, Muhammad, all fatherless. Jesus, Shakespeare, Abraham Lincoln, and Alexander the Great all had a healthy father, and Hitler had an abusive father. We'll come back to Hitler in a minute. At Princeton, a sociologist stated over half of all children born in the United States today will, if current trends continue, live apart from at least one of their biological parents, usually the father, before they reach adulthood. A substantial proportion, about 1/5, will never even live with their fathers. As evidence above has shown, assuming current trends don't change, over half of all children will grow up with a defective father. What impact does this have on humanity at its core? Like, literally, if we take into these statistics, hypothetically, half of y'all in this room could have grown up with a defective father. My old good friend, Paul C. Vitz, observed from Sigmund Freud that a child's psychological representation of his father is intimately connected to his understanding with God. And Vitz is a psychologist, at New York University, and it's a very prestigious school. And I just thought that was a really cool observation that he and Freud kind of both made. And I want to take it and apply it to this. This is a reflection, and it's also, a really nice painting, so I figured I would put it up instead of like a random mirror photo. But we have this reflection, and essentially, the father is meant to reflect God to his child. They write about this in the Resolution for Men, and one really strong example of this is Psalms 23. Psalms 23 is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. And the first verse, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Let's take that picture of the Lord and put the Father in there. Hypothetically, if the Father is meant to reflect the Lord, that would say, my Father, or the Father is my shepherd, I shall not want. And if a father is not providing for his family, hypothetically, the child could interpret that God will not be providing for him. If a father is abusive or hateful towards his child, the child could interpret that as a father that will be abusive or hate him. So the Resolution for Men, I just held it up, states that the overwhelming majority of prisoners, drug users, dropouts, runaways, rapists, youth suicides, and kids with behavioral disorders are the result of fatherless homes. Kids are 20 times more likely to end up in prison if their dad is not involved in their lives. And the shocking statistic, while it is very sad, it goes a lot into showing like the importance of having a good father, because these are the statistics of why a bad father is bad. But I also think they emphasize the importance of why a good father is good. However, they also show the awesomeness of God, who is a father to the fatherless. If God is willing to be a father to the fatherless, it shows his grace in that immaculate way, how he is able to help all the fatherless and defective kids overcome these boundaries and these hurdles that they may face. Now, let's go back to our reflection here. We'll call him Jim Bob. Why not? Let's say we could hypothetically know that Jim Bob was going to grow up and be the president of the United States of America. Well, we want to see what his childhood was like and know what his fatherhood relationship was like. But unfortunately, we can't, because that's just like time barrier. And even if we happen to have a DeLorean to go back in time and ask Jim Bob, we would not even really be able to find where he is. But I think there's still a way that we can interpret what is in Jim Bob's mind. Now, how do we do this? Dallas Willard writes, "We don't believe something by merely saying we believe it, or even when we believe it, that we believe it. We believe something when we act as if it were true." And the best way for us, just literally period, for us to interpret what these influencers are thinking, especially how their fathers have influenced them, is by seeing what they've done with their lives. An example of this is Hitler. I told you we'd come back to Hitler. So Hitler is in a very unique position in world history as one of the most influential people of all time, but it's not necessarily for a good cause. There is one point in which my good old friend Dr. Paul C. Vitz writes that Hitler was approached by one of his top advisors, and Hitler literally just seemed the most distraught that he had ever been. And this was because Hitler had just come out of a meeting with an archbishop who was very opposed to him and was literally telling Hitler, like, hey, Jesus was a Jew. You are literally persecuting Jesus. And after this half-an-hour meeting went on for several hours, Hitler was just so shaken. And Hitler, as Dr. Paul C. Vitz states, chose to cultivate his hatred, not to repress or resolve it. Hitler had a clear choice, and he made his choice. Another example, but of someone who God used their fatherlessness for good, is William Wilberforce. Wilberforce had his dad die whenever he was just 9 years old, and because of this, his mom sent him to live with his aunt and uncle, who were both strong Christians, and through this, he actually got the awesome opportunity to be mentored by all these different people that his aunt and uncle were welcoming into their home. Some of these people were George Whitefield, who led one of the Great Awakenings in the United States. Another person was John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. John Newton was a slave trader, and you may not believe this, but without Wilberforce, slavery may still exist today. Wilberforce was the leading charge for the end of slavery in the British Empire, which the British Empire literally influenced the entire world in slavery. And because of this, and because of God's grace, Wilberforce literally ended slavery in the world. And God just used him as an awesome instrument in that way. So just two powerful examples of how God can use those who are fatherless, but ultimately, like, it's a choice. And kind of think again back to Hitler. I think he's a really good example. His father was abusive to him, and because his father showed hatred towards him, Hitler viewed God as hate. And with that, it left a God-shaped hole in his heart. And each of us has a God-shaped hole in our hearts, and if we try to fill that hole with anything other than God, we will be left disappointed and unsatisfied. Here are some takeaways for us today. Christians can and need to, where they can, minister to those with defective fathers like Wilberforce, Hitler, and so many more. And another takeaway, which I think is really important, especially for all the guys in the room to hear, is to be a perfect father is not something that men should require of themselves. You do not need to demand perfection out of yourself because we are insufficient. Instead, the man in his need should turn to God, and God is willing to supply grace to meet us in our need, as 2 Corinthians 12:9 says. So, literally, first off, just kind of bringing this all back together for you to just package and take away. Fathers have a huge influence on the home, but even more so than that, even whenever a father fails, God's grace can and will show through. The best way for fathers to influence future generations is by stewarding the opportunity of the future influencers growing up in their households. This is only possible by God's grace. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for tuning in to the Overflow Post. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And be sure to check out our website, www.theoverflowpost.com. Thank you guys so much for listening. And if this podcast blessed you, please be sure to give us a review and share it with your friends. Remember, guys, share the overflow. This is Simon. God bless.